My name is Lovro. I believe you all know you all know me because of the great job that the Instagram team that did. That was very nice. I love the graphic design and generally what you guys did. But so I just want to have a brief introduction before we actually go into the workshop. So obviously this is going to be one workshop. I already did one, I think, for a different society in Brazil recently. So as WUDC 2023 team for Madrid, this is a part of the, let's say, greater strategy and aim that we have. And this is specifically to integrate Latin America and some of the Portuguese and Spanish speaking countries more into English BP, because we think that you guys have a very developed internal internal networks and worlds of your own. So when we think about Portuguese worlds or Spanish worlds, so we want to basically also make you as comfortable, bridge some gaps or differences that might exist in like the, let's say, English debating versus Portuguese, Brazilian debating, Spanish debating, so that you guys feel more comfortable that there are more teams coming to worlds as well. And I think specifically when we talk about Madrid, this is going to be more accessible than any of the recent worlds for Brazilians in general. Maybe Mexico, but I think that also, although it's closer, tickets to Mexico are also rather expensive, or were rather expensive in 2018, for maybe those of you who are a little bit older and remember that. So in the end, we have a good combination here, because tickets are going to be fairly more cheap than they usually are, and we have good cooperation with Yorcom, who is active in SMUDE in the Spanish worlds, and we are kind of trying to facilitate this with the Portuguese worlds as well. I have good experience with Portuguese debaters. Specifically, I did some workshops there, training academies. I don't know if there's sort of like rivalry, or are you guys like big friends? Probably depends. When you are in international circuits, then you hang out together. When you are on the Portuguese language worlds, then you are probably like rivalries a little bit. I think that's how it works. But anyhow, so this is our long-term plan before Worlds. Obviously, this is in a year and a half, so we are not actually doing something which is systematic right now. But things like this obviously can help to some extent to get to know us, and so that you guys feel that there is someone who is making the effort, so that you feel more integrated. But more on that later. So what is the outline of the workshop? I've talked to Nicholas about what you guys want me to do, and basically there have been different ideas, so I did my best to separate the workshop in like little parts, 15 minutes or so, where we're going to discuss different things. So starting from prep time and framing, and then like burdens of proof, and then some on engaging and weighing, a little bit of rebuttal, and then meta debating. So a little bit of everything. The focus is that we're going to talk a lot, as much as possible, on motions, concrete scenarios, rather than only talking about theory, because I mean, you can look at a lot of workshops online for theory. So the practice, the point is that you can perform these things better, or not that you theoretically know what should have been done, because we all know what theoretically should have been done, and that doesn't mean that we are successful in achieving that. Okay, so this is going to take 45 minutes to an hour. In some instances, I'm going to ask you to also participate, because this is the best way, I feel like, for people to get to know how to actually do this in practice. And then in the end, I think, depending on how much time we're going to have, I'll leave the floor open for questions, so you can ask something which you guys think is important, or I didn't mention in the workshop, or just in general. Okay, if there are questions at any point, you can also ask them, but if it's something which is not related, or you feel like can be done in the end, then leave it till the end, so that we can have some sort of structure. Okay, so if there's no questions on the outline itself, I'll start with prep time and framing. And basically, here's what I think is the most important thing here. I think the most important thing in prep is to differentiate to some extent what happens in prep when you're opening to what happens in prep when you're closing. And a couple of questions also were raised on this issue. So the biggest goal when you're opening, this of course is also applicable to some extent to closing. but it matters more in opening because this is where people oftentimes get it wrong. It's basically three things. One is to predict the debate that is going to unfold. Second is to neutralize the opposition arguments before they even have a chance to run them. And the third, it is to weigh the case you will bring to the debate. Of course, you're going to create arguments. Of course, you're going to matter dump and all of this stuff. But these are the things which you intuitively probably do already in prep. And these are the things where, I mean, if you are debating, you know that every single round, you're going to have some sort of arguments, you're going to fill out time, right? So probably when we were all starting, this was the biggest fear for all of us, whether I'm going to speak for 7 minutes or not. Then after a couple of debates which you've done, it's no longer a problem. So the biggest issue is that people do not necessarily recognize what is the most important issue in the debate, or they focus too much on creating arguments and too little on what the other side is going to say and how the debate is going to unfold. So let me give you an example. For example, when predicting the debate, I think it's important to spend time figuring out what teams will disagree on and what will be the major clashes in this debate. So what are the things which you need to run which are going to be relevant? This is when people say you need to remain relevant till the end of the debate. Your arguments cannot be like something which fall out of the debate. But basically, in the end, it's about figuring how the other teams which are coming after you are going to, have a stance in the debate, and how you can make arguments which respond to these things and still win the debate. Specifically, if you're opening argument, but this is also very applicable to opening opposition. So you should try to figure out what framing teams will use, and if there are uncertainties, try to resolve them as soon as possible or minimize the effect of the resolution on your case. So for example, if as closing a model defines your stance in a debate, then you should, as soon as possible in prep time, figure out what is the likely model that opening argument is going to use. And if you cannot pinpoint that they are definitely going to use that model, then you should focus on the two scenarios in which you have to then act, right? If they choose model A, this is what we're going to do. If they choose model B, this is what they're going to do. Because you have very little opportunity from as closing to influence what model OG is actually going to set up in the debate. So one example of this. So for example, this is the motion in the post-COVID world. This house would significantly tax tourism in big tourist cities, such as Amsterdam, Prague, Barcelona, and like significantly tax, meaning, taxing peer-to-peer renting like Airbnb, low-cost flights, and overnight stay taxes. This was set at one European comps, so all of the examples are from Europe, but they can be easily applicable to biggest tourist spaces, basically everywhere. And so, how can you use framing, for example, on opening government to set the debate in a way that favors you more? So you can basically talk about how, because of COVID, and it happens on both sides of the house, how money, for example, that was given by state to tourism sectors in a lot of cases during COVID actually warrants you that you have something back in return from the sector. Or the idea that given there is very little tourist consumption and demand in the status quo, these sort of scenarios, because these cities are empty because there is no tourist, that this is the biggest or the best time for you to act in a way where you can actually limit the amount of tourists which are coming to the countries. So these are not necessarily arguments which are happening, right? We're not talking about why these cities would be better if they had less tourists, or people inside of these cities would have a lower cost of living. They wouldn't have to pay, a bunch of dollars for their rent, but the rent would be lower, or like they could have a coffee in the city center and not like get crowded out by rich folks who go there. But we're specifically talking about framing here, and if you say that the framing is such that there is not a lot of tourists in these cities in the status quo, then all of the harms that opposition is going to throw at you, such as these cities are going to lose a lot of revenue, blah blah blah, are minimized by this framing. So very important, because you put yourself in a better position, and you haven't even started to engage with them in terms of rebuttal, right? It's only your framing that has enabled you to do so. So you're saving time here, and you are more effective in how much they can engage with you, because they first have to engage with the framing in order to bring the arguments that they were going to bring, right? So this is one example. Let's also see another way to do so, and this is like neutralizing opposition arguments. So you identify what the other bench is going to run, and you see how you can force them to develop an argument while taking into account your limitations you set, or like how they fail to meet your burden. So basically, you use a lot of pre-battle as government, and this is important because eventually this is what is going to win you the debate in a lot of cases. So I'm going to give you an example again. And before that, also, it's important to weigh the arguments you bring. This is what we're going to see on this example as well. So the motion is this House would apply a lower rate of income tax to one. And so the first thing is we are going to try to neutralize the argument coming from opposition. So the argument from opposition could be that people are going to know this is happening and that they could compensate for the lower tax by paying out lower wages. So a little bit of mathematics. I know that you guys love that. So let's say that starting wage was 1,000 and the tax was 200. What is left to the average worker is basically 800, right? That is clear. So if you reduce the tax, let's say that it becomes 100, that it's fixed. We're going to do it like really basically here. What could happen is that the employer is going to pay 900, tax is 100, and then people are still left with 800, which is not something which you want as your policy, right? Ideally, we want women to have more, more money because of problems like the wage gap, or because you want to incentivize more employment by women. You want to incentivize women to not be out of the labor force, spend as much time doing household chores, etc., etc. So different arguments. So what can we do in framing? We're not even in arguments. We are in the model stage. What is going to happen to the debate? We can just simply say, look, we're not going to do this on a monthly basis, right? So the tax on a monthly basis is still going to remain the same, but at the end of each year, we're going to return the difference in tax to women, right? So, if your wage was X, it still is going to be X, but at the end of the year, you're going to get the difference between the higher tax and the lower tax as a lump sum payment, one-time payment during the year. So, if employees want to, they cannot screw you on this sort of scenario, because obviously you are going to have a lower wage if they lower your wage on a monthly basis. So this is something where we figured out how to remove an opposition argument from the debate by carefully planning the model that we are going to use, and basically inserting 2 or 3 sentences in the model. Just to check, we can do this because it's a this house would, right? So if it was a this house believes that, we could have still have done it, but we would have to need to explain why this is likely, as opposed to when it's a this house would, we have the fiat to basically do whatever is sensible. Okay, so what is sensible is up to the discussion, but generally we can do this. And then a similar example on the same topic. What we were talking about, the third idea, and this is the weighing the arguments that you bring. So not necessarily thinking about developing the argument, but basically weighing it against the other possibilities. In this specific motion, there is obviously going to be a gap in the state budget that you're going to create through this, right? So this gap could have, in the counter world, not necessarily that there's going to be a counter prop here from opening opposition, but let's assume that there is one, or that there is a counter argument which says, instead of reducing taxes, basically reducing spending, we could have had the taxes remain the same level, and then use the spending basically on something else, something which might be more targeted at women specifically who need help the most. So we can talk about shelters, we can talk about employment schemes for women who are over 55, who are very, difficult to employ, etc., etc. So basically, what are we doing here from opening government, or from government, but most likely from opening government? We are realizing why our solution to the problem, which is the one that we are defending, is the best one. And we are trying to compare it with the potential alternatives that are going to come from oppositions in this sort of debate, or even from closing government, if that's going to be the way that they are going to be doing. So it's always important to recognize why the alternative that you are proposing is the best one in the world or in general. So these are the three things which I think are really important from opening government. We'll later do an example so you guys can practice this, but basically predict the debate that is going to unfollow, neutralize the opposition arguments, and weigh the case you will bring to the debate. There is a, how I will call this like very EPL, because this is the point that I'm going to be talking later on. Mostly you guys here are ESL, right? So, you know, a part of the job of fighting with EPL people is that you learn their vocabulary to some extent. You debate and you listen how they throw like these really nice queen words at you, queen English, and then you start using them as well, and then they change to a new word. Yeah, exactly, delta. Then they change to a new word because it's not posh enough if ESL people are still using it as them, and you know, it's a constant circle. Pernicious incentives. This is what I wanted to use. There's a pernicious incentive from opening government, specifically for those of you who are speaking prime minister. And this is that you focus on the speech that you're going to give. So that very early in the prep time, you stop talking to the deputy prime minister and you focus basically on your speech and you make arguments. And this is usually when, instead of, for example, prepping for 12 minutes and focusing on your speech for 3 minutes, you prep for 7 minutes and you focus on your speech for 8 minutes. And then you miss out on a lot of things that happen later on in the debate. You might have a better PM and you might analyze points better. You might come up with new examples. Rhetorically, you might be better. But in the end, these are, in 90% of cases, if not even more, outweighed by the stuff that you have failed to discuss, by something which you have failed to see is important to the motion, relevant, by failing to plan out the debate. So especially when you are debating with a stable partner, if you have that, but also you can practice this with other people if you're constantly like changing. It is important to get yourself in a position where you can maximize the amount of prep time that you use in opening, specifically in opening government, for figuring out the debate, for talking to debate, etc., etc. And how can you do this? Well, basically, you can do this in a way so that you as prime minister, you minimize the amount of time that is needed for you to prepare the speech. So be very efficient about writing, be very efficient about taking things down. But also, if you are spending, let's say, if you are willing to spend some extra time in debating, firstly, every debate that you basically have is a stock of arguments that you are accessing. So in every debate, you are going to see some arguments being developed. And the more you see debates, you're going to see more and more arguments. So at this point, depending on your experience, of course, but there are certainly people who already can do this really well. And for people who can't, they're going to do this with time. There are some arguments which you know how to run, right? So, you know, you see the motion and you think, okay, this is the argument. I've heard it run 3 times before. I've ran it with my partner 2 times before. I've heard my partner do this. We don't have to spend that much time on this. So you can increase the amount of these things that happen to you. One, but just listening to argument and but just thinking in this way. So there are certain stock arguments, you know, why the state is not efficient in economic redistribution. This is one that happens in a lot of economic debates that you can run. Or why there's a principle of agency which you can run. Like the epistemic access as well. So these are all the things which we make memes about. These are very prevalent. So if you know them by heart, you can spend 1 minute on developing this argument, basically, because you know you are adding specific examples or you are contextualizing it for the specific debate, connecting it. But in general, you don't have to spend 5 minutes to develop it. And the more you have these arguments, the more you're conscious about this, and the more, even if you, as I said, if you want to go further, if you want to spend more time on debating, you can write these things. You can talk to your partner, see, okay, we have 10 stock arguments. Let's try to go to 15 or 20. It doesn't have to be written somewhere, but it needs to be that you and your partner can quickly figure out the communication so that the argument is ran in debate, right? I think particularly for the PM, this is important, because if you're PM or if you are PM, and if you are successful in this, then you and the DPM can have much more communication during prep time on what is going to happen later. You can figure out these framing issues, you can figure out the weighing issues, you can figure out what the opposition is going to say, where the debate breaks, whether you are on clash, whether you are strategic in your setup of the debate. And I guarantee you, the minutes that you gain there in terms of this are the minutes which are going to drastically improve how you perform in opening, specifically in opening argument. So this is a trade-off. It is a trade-off, but it's a trade-off worth taking. And it's a little bit in the beginning seems like a the leap of faith, because we always have these fears whether it's going to be a good PM, whether people are going to understand me, whether I'm going to develop everything, bring everything to the table, matter dump or whatever. But in the end, you'll notice that this is worth it. If you don't trust me, look at debates, like debates which happen in out rounds of big competitions, and see how much time actually is spent in prime minister and deputy prime minister on using sentences like, this is what this debate is not about. This is what they are going to claim from opposition. This is why this is not true. This is why you can't have an extension on this basis and blah, 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 blah. These are all of the quantifiers. You can listen to it in the speech and you can figure out, okay, this is the part where they talked about in, I don't know, 2 minutes in prep time to figure out what this debate is about and what it's not about. And then they used it in the speech as to outframe the other bench. So this is something which I think is really useful in the end. Okay, guys, so I just want to give you a quick overview on the framing part as well, similarly to what we did here in prep, and then we're going to do one example motion. So basically, with framing, I think there are 3 questions, similarly to what we had with prep time. So, is the debate under the influence of recent developments in the real world, and can I use that to my advantage? The second one is, are there different contexts under the debate happens, and can I frame the debate so that one or more which basically suit me is the one under which the debate is going to happen? And how can my framing in the debate fill important gaps to how the round unfollows and how contributions are weighed by the panel? So basically, with the first one, with recent developments, you should look for real world implication of the model. Has there been a similar discussion on the issue? Has there been a policy that is similar? Was this published in social media? You should use the examples judges and teams are likely to be familiar with in your favor to show credibility and gain a position of actually referring what the debate is about. When teams try to do this. Oh, this is what the debate is actually about from closing. And whether this is going to work or not is whether you're going to have or create this connection with the panel, right? So imagine if you're judging the debate and then opening spends a lot of time talking about the motion, but that they're like doing arguments, they're not really getting the crux. And if someone from closing comes and gives you the 3 examples, and these are the actual examples when you heard the motion that you were thinking about, okay, this is where the debate is actually taking place, then obviously you are in a better position to frame this debate. So I want to give you an example here. So in the motion, let me just copy this. This house prefers secular governments that exclude all religion from public spaces to those that allow all religions in public spaces. There's a spaces in the end. So basically, I don't know what the situation is on public display of religion in Brazil. I would assume that you guys are majoritarily very much Catholic, so that is what people mostly do. But for example, in France, they're really against this. They have this system of laïcité, and basically they don't allow public displays of religion. So this is something which is neutral knowledge. So from opposition, how do we use what is happening currently in order to empower this? Well, what we're basically going to claim is that nowadays, if you are a Catholic or if you are a Protestant or generally if you're Christian, there is not a lot of things which you display in public. Maybe you're going to have a cross around your neck, and this is something which which you can't even see. But for minority religions, for example, specifically in these type of countries, if you're Jewish or if you're Muslim, there are a lot of things that you need to necessarily use as a part of your religion in terms of head coverings or in terms of a specific wardrobe that you use that generally very much define your religion as you see it, and they are a part of your identity. So from opening opposition, in the beginning, we are framing this debate as, look, guys, there is a disproportionate effect if we use this, if we ban all public mentions of religions. And this is a problem because it's going to disproportionately target, in these cases, minority groups of religious people. So we didn't do anything special. We didn't create an argument. We just said framing, look, this is happening in Switzerland, I don't know, France right now. They're banning this, or they have already banned this. And the response there was that minority religions, or religions which were already to some extent, marginalized, were hit most. So framing, which instinctively tilts the debate a little bit to our side of the house. So similar to this, when we are talking about contextualizing the debate. So when we are thinking of plausible scenarios under which the debate can unfold, and the examples here can be, developing world versus developed world, more democratic regimes versus less democratic regimes, liberal environments versus conservative environments. And you can figure out which of them suits the argument you would make, or the position that you would defend in this debate better, or which makes for a better contextual shield against the opposition arguments or against the government arguments. So it acts as a framing mitigatory shield, right? So if I contextualize the debate as, this is mostly relevant in very, very liberal countries, where 90% of people are basically very open, very progressive, there's very little people who are conservative. Then the argument coming from the other side, which says there is going to be backlash from conservatives if you go forward with this progressive motion, is automatically a very low impact argument, because the framing stands that these people are very much, something which are small in society. The opposite can be true as well, right? You can frame the debate as this is a very conservative society, so the impact which you're going to have on the opening maybe of some of these issues is for public debate or changing some laws is very minimal if the framing is as I tell you this. So what's going to be the example for this one? For example, why is it not copying the whole thing? I'm having technical problems. I'm a boomer. So this house believes that green political parties should take pro-capitalist stances as well as form coalition with right-wing parties. So obviously, this debate is kind of neutral. There are a lot of things to talk about whether this is going to be good or bad. But if you form this debate, for example, if you frame this debate in places where a lot of right-wing parties are currently in power, obviously then you can from government say this is a good thing because this enables green parties to be in power, and this is good because the emission laws can be put in place, or some things that support the environment more. What is another part of framing which you can use? You can say that a lot of countries, generally globally, because of historical reasons, have affinity to the way a capitalist system works as opposed to the alternatives. So obviously there are big problems with capitalism, but if you come to Eastern Europe, and I would imagine to a bunch of Latin American countries as well, they wouldn't be that willing to change to something which is different to capitalism, to communism, because of historical reasons. There are some negative connotations, etc., etc. So in these sort of instances, if you frame the debate as this is where the debate takes place largely, then the question becomes, does this harm you a lot if you are anti-capitalist in these sort of environments because of historical reasons, because of something which is not going to change in the debate, right? This is set, and this is something which the policy doesn't affect, right? So you can think about ways in which you can do this in various debates as well. I think the important thing to stress here is that you are not squirreling the debate. You are not saying this debate only happens in this one country, and this is where it's important that Green Party is actually, be in power. You're not saying that. You're basically saying, here, take a look at all of the contexts in which this debate can happen. This is the most likely one, or this is the most impactful one. This is the one that you should talk about, and this enables you then. So how do you quantify it? I mean, you can never quantify it specifically. You can say, oh, we're talking about 17 countries out of 28 countries. But for a majority of debates, if you have a strong framing, which says, okay, look, there is a lot of countries which have history of anti-capitalist regimes, and these were largely unpopular with people do not live in good conditions, and for better or for worse, they want to maintain a capitalist system of governments where they do want some intrusion by the government, but they want to keep it on a social democratic level and not an anti-capitalist level, right? And this is not necessarily a quantifier, but it gives good how do you say, it gives good traction that this is relevant for a lot of cases. There might be some cases where you can be more specific than this, but generally this is what's going to happen. So for example, in the first example for framing, secular governments, here you can be even more definitive with the framing in terms of quantifying it. You can say there are very little governments in the world, or very little countries, where there is only one religion, or where most of the big religions are basically very similar in the amount of followers and connection they have with the public sphere. So there you can almost automatically say there are always going to be minority religions in these places. And then the argument which we talked about before, how they are harmed, actually gets emphasized. So I guess it depends from the motion to the motion, but as long as you are realistic and you're connecting to the panel in that way, it gives you an advantage because it moves the debate a little bit towards where you are, which is why I think that being realistic is a quantifier enough, right? If you say this only happens in countries which are ex-communist, then obviously people are going to be like, no. But if you say that this happens in countries which are ex-communist, and this is where it's really important, then people are going to trust you and say, okay, even if on balance we're not sure where to decide this motion, it happens also in contexts where we would definitely say that Green parties should do this. So this is I think how you do it for a large amount of cases. And the third framing is basically, or the third purpose of framing is that you fill gaps, and that you look for important gaps of debate missed by other teams, potentially openings, if you can do this, and see how you can create or point out a hole in their mechanization or impacts they claim if the hole is not addressed. And you should explain why your framing uniquely addresses it or opens it up for discussion. And I'm actually going to open this one up. Well, not this one. I'll do it with the next one. So for the purposes of saving time, but just one example of this. So this house believes that developing countries should privatize their state-owned enterprise. What you can do, for example, from closing here, you can point out why the whole process itself is going to be more of a problem than for example, the end state. So what do I mean by this? So from closing opposition, let's say that opening opposition hasn't really touched there. You're obviously going to have a debate here, what is more efficient? And what serves citizens better? And OG is going to say, okay, private companies generally more efficient, blah, blah, blah. Oppositions are going to say, oh, but state companies care about citizens, and these are like bad capitalists. They're going to just take money away from our country, and we're going to pay more in the end to have worse service, etc., etc. So what can you do from closing opposition to break the deadlock is to say, okay, there are obviously benefits to private companies and to state-owned companies. What is inherent in this debate is that there needs to be a process of privatization. Here is why these governments, oftentimes, if this is the case, have not been involved in the process of privatization. So we are not saying that they are not competent at all, because that would be significantly reducing their ability to be efficient in the management of these state-owned enterprises, right? If you're saying that something is really efficient or a corrupt government, then on the other hand, all of my questions from government are, but how can then they run efficiently these state-owned enterprises? So you're making the framing very specific, and you're saying they don't have experience with privatization. This is severely different than to operating a state-owned enterprise, because you've been doing this for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but you don't have experts who are experts in privatization. No one has done this before. This is why the specific process of privatization is going to be bad. You're not going to be able to negotiate well. You're not going to get enough money for what the companies are worth it. And this is basically how you are filling the gap with your framing, because you are reframing the debate. You're saying, given that openings cannot necessarily agree which model of government is better, what we are giving to you in the debate is that changing from one model to the other model is what brings most harm in this debate, right? So something which they probably didn't explain. And then you can add on mechanisms here talking about the symmetry. So if you're a big company that is specializing in taking over these things from nationally owned to privately owned, and they basically privatize things, you've done this a lot of times. You have lawyers, you have economists, you have financial experts, you are aware of how much something is worth, and then you are probably aware of how much you can give for something. And this asymmetry compared to your government, where you've never done this before, you don't have experience, is how you mechanize this. But yeah, this is probably how to mechanize this is a different story, probably for the analysis workshop. But what is important here is to see that there's a potential for you to open up the debate for new contributions through your framing. Okay, I wanna talk to you guys about this through one motion in general. So we can also introduce here a little bit, just before we do that, what are the burden of proofs, basically. And I think that the burden of proof generally is that you prove that the motion is doable, and that the motion is to some extent also legitimate or justified, that it's efficient. So the example which I always use, it's probably very, how to say, very not realistic, but it serves the purpose really well. It would be very justified, very cool, if the government would buy everyone a BMW. That's very cool. No one would be opposed to that. But on the other hand, it would be very inefficient, right? So this would be something which the government couldn't afford. On the other hand, it would be probably very efficient if we just stopped paying all people who are in pensions, if we stopped paying them pensions, and we invested in the youth, right, in you guys, students, improve the quality of education. In the long term, this would definitely be very useful, right? Because you would have better education, better productivity in the economy. On the other hand, like, it wouldn't be that much justified to just not give people money that they deserved and to basically leave them with it. So basically, all of the motions have these sort of two contexts to them, which I think serves the purpose of explaining that principled arguments and practical arguments are equally important a priori, and that depending on the context of the debate, depending on how the motion is worded, this is where you basically get these sort of differentiations. So what are some of the other theoretical things that I think are important in burdens of proof? And then we're going to move on to the practical example, I promise. So basically, there's the idea of criteria. So what is the most important criteria in the debate? So for example, this is oftentimes the case with regrets or narratives motions, because this is where the criteria takes into place what is the most important thing for you or not. So I have this motion which says, I don't have it written. I have it written on the notes, so I'm just going to read it out to you. It's very quick. This house supports the rise of political campaigning on social media. So this house supports the rise of political campaigning on social media. So when you're thinking of what should I run in this debate, what is important, I think basically you almost instantaneously face the question of what is the most important criteria in political campaigning. And obvious on one hand from opposition, maybe what you are going to get here is that this can be very manipulative, right? That social media can be manipulated more by candidates or by fake news or whatever, as opposed to traditional media news sources. So this is the criteria that you get from opposition. Thank you. Thank you. And from government, what you're going to get, basically, you can get the criteria of this is accessible to people, right? Because it's very easy to just go on social media, especially for younger people, younger generations, people who use this, and then get your information from candidates there. So what is your burden of proof? Well, basically, your burden of proof, if we are talking specifically only about these criteria, is to figure out which one is more important, right? Whether the idea that this can be easily manipulative, or whether the idea that this is accessible is more important for campaigning. Now, of course, in debating, what you're going to do is a bunch of engagement, rebuttal, analysis. So it's ultimately going to depend on whether you prove that this motion harms or benefits accessibility, or harms or benefits the integrity of the campaigning problem. But when you think about burdens of proof, and when you like realize that this is something which is going to happen in a debate, it is very important for you to also think why your criteria in this sort of sense, if it's an important part of the burdens of proof, is more important than the other side. So a lot of questions were asked on the basis of weighing. So this is a good example where we should do, weighing in what is more important for the political campaigning. Why does it matter for the political process or not? So this is one thing. The second thing I think is when we talk about rights. So when we talk about burdens of proof in debates which either take or give rights to people. So, for example, when you are taking away a certain right, what you should prove, or your burden of proof is from government, is that this right a priori doesn't exist, right? That this is not absolute, and that this is something which shouldn't be neglected, which shouldn't be restricted by the state. So this house would ban the denial of genocide, right? So what is your thought or burden of proof from government here? You know that generally people have freedom of speech. People can talk to some extent whatever they want. So you are taking this right, and you're not saying this doesn't exist or this is not important, but you're getting into when this is important and to what extent. You can say people can criticize their politicians. This is okay. You can say people can get in a fight. That's okay. Maybe we should put microphones so that people can go in a park and voice their political opinion, and that is okay. People can claim that our side was stolen in the war, that we were that there were traitors who made us lose the war. But where we draw the line is basically when people deny genocide, and this is where you're basically saying that there is no specific right to deny these things, and that all of the other rights in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of having your maybe wrong view on this idea, is something which is acceptable, but you draw the line at denying the genocide. Of course, different mechanisms here on how this affects victims, basically why this is something which is the worst thing for them, how this makes the sphere of public opinion very toxic, blah blah blah. These are all of the arguments, but it's important to frame this criteria as a sort of tipping point, right? So there are a bunch of bad things which we would allow, we wouldn't ban, but here is where we draw the line. Very important. Let me give you another example. This one is very easy, and this is basically when you're talking about violence for kids, for little people. So on one hand, the most non-extreme form of violence is comic books. How they put two people and then there's like a bang and there's a leg, for example, and the person kicks them, right? So this is generally always acceptable in all of the countries, the systems. On the other side of the spectrum, there is live violence. So, for example, you allow kids to go to boxing matches, Ultimate Fighting Championship. There's a kid, 11, and he boxes there. So obviously, most countries are in between. And for example, what emotion can be is that this house would ban high realistic violent games, shooter games. So this house would ban high realistic violent shooter games. I don't know how much you play, but like a bunch of these, PUBG, I don't know, Fortnite, these are very much popular nowadays. People play on phones as well. So obviously this is somewhere in between. So it's not enough to say, okay, this one thing is banned or this other thing is banned. You need to show to the panel and to generally the debate of why a specific right, and obviously rights to freedom and to engage in some sort of behavior here versus the duty of the government to protect its kids from influence that might, harm their development, or which are basically too demanding for them to understand, that might cause them emotional trauma. These incentives sometimes clash, and these rights sometimes clash, no matter where you put the scale. Your burden is to prove that this one specific thing falls on the idea of either allowing it because there's freedom and people can engage freely and there are parents who are going to control this, or banning this outright because parents can't control this, and this is inherently going to cause trauma, etc., etc. So this is generally when we're talking about, for example, rights, or we are talking about banning something. The first approach that you should have is to explain why this thing should be banned, as opposed to other things which you might still allow. On the other hand, this is also applicable, for example, when you are closing. You ask people whether they would ban this other thing. You're trying to catch them in being not consistent with their principle. And this is a good POI because they're either confused or they accept something which they otherwise wouldn't accept. So this is something which is important. And I think the last thing before we go into the practical things is that you should generally be able to figure out whether a motion is big burden or low burden, or whether you want to take a strategy of taking the big burden or taking the low burden. So oftentimes what team do on the first half of the debate is they take the low burden and then they do even if arguments, right? So they take the low burden, I'm not sure, I can't read my own handwriting here, just 1 second. Okay, so for example, this house as China would want to become the only global economic force. So this house is China. I'm going to write it because it's very common, this house. Would want to become the only global superpower, or would work to become, I think is better, would work. Sorry, I'm translating this from Croatian, so ESL. So would work to become the only global superpower. What you can do from OG, and what is a perfectly legitimate gov, is that you explain, we are saying that they're not going to become this. Here is why working towards becoming this is a benefit, right? You get more pride as a nation, people support you more, there is more motivation because this is the end goal, or it's very, very easy to motivate people maybe to go into some sort of state business because they think that they are going to help this big goal, blah, 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 blah. So you talk about just the idea or just the path of achieving this. Therefore, if oppositions come and say, no, but United States is very economically strong, they have big military, they are diplomatically very powerful, these arguments hurt you very little, right? And you can then, from opening argument, do an even if case. Okay, so here are likely things why we are going to succeed in this, and then the benefits for China if they become the only global power. You can police the world, you can implement your own economic rules, you can basically be the diplomatic superpower, blah, 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 right? But your burden of proof, the burden you took was that this is worth trying. And then oppositions might try to force on you that your burden of proof is to show that this is possible, this is going to succeed. But obviously this, and this is why exactly you didn't take that burden, because it's harder to prove. And then if this was the case in a debate, and if you are closing, what you can then do for closing is to take a bigger burden. So to say our opening proved you benefits, why if China tries this, there are going to be inherent benefits for China. On the other hand, we are going to prove benefits. We're going to prove that China is going to be successful in this and that our benefits are larger. Okay, so this is where I want to do the example, where I want you guys to actually take part active here. So this was the debate which was recently set in US UDC, and it's connected to Brazil. Obviously, I don't know how you guys think politically. That's beyond the point. Don't be mad. I've read a lot about Brazilian politics, but I don't know as much as you do. So this house believes it is in the interest of Brazil that Lula runs in 2022 elections. So this was the motion, and what we're going to figure out from OG basically, what is your burden of proof? What is the framing that you guys would use here? So I'm listening to anyone who wants to volunteer.
Maybe in first place that the burden that Lula running the election is a moral thing.
Okay, so a moral thing from what perspective?
And so Lula had some judgments of his conduct, so maybe it is not moral for him to being elected again.
Okay, but we're talking from OG, so
yes, like as supreme government, I guess I would point out, or I would pin out that Lula, whenever he runs in some kind of election, he will polarize it, and it will be harder for like leftist leaders to rise, and it will be easier for right-wing media or right-wing politicians to demonize him, or whenever he comes in running an election, the elections get messier. So maybe like if he runs in 2022, the outcome would be worse because it would be less predictable once like that people hate Bolsonaro, but they also hate Lula. And like the judiciary, like the judges here in Brazil or the other politicians, they might persecute Lula again or turn like 2022 in all on some kind of 2018 part 2, and the outcome would be something like somewhat worse than it was before. So we shouldn't allow Lula to come because it would hurt the left-wing parties, and the right-wing parties would also be like somewhat like with hurt feelings or would have some problem with it.
So that's cool, but you were both, I think, analyzing opening opposition. So because opening government says that it's in the interest of Brazil that Lula runs in 2022.
I think maybe the fact that we have a lot of spread out third parties running, and maybe Lula is the only way to win against the right-wing Bolsonaro.
Okay, cool. But I think Guilherme didn't want to speak, but he wrote to us. So this is what I was aiming for. So the low burden argument here is that running itself is beneficial for Brazil. So, flip the argument which Nicolas was saying. It's not going to be polarizing, it's going to be great, or, I mean, obviously you guys know a lot more about this than me, so I don't want to make any examples. So I'm from Croatia. The only thing I know is that we are currently maybe a little bit better in football than you. Is this a bigger insult than talking about your politics? Definitely. I'm just joking. But generally, so obviously the lower burden of proof, you can have this sort of stance. You can say, okay, here's why if Lula runs, he doesn't have to win, doesn't have to win the election. This is a benefit in and of itself for politics because of this and this reasons. On the other hand, a bigger burden would be, okay, here's why Lula is going to win the election, right? So this is the differentiation which you strategically need to figure out what you want to take from opening government. Probably you are focusing yourself on the lower burden case, then saying, here are the additional reasons why we think he's going to win, and this is why this is better, obviously. And then from closing, you might want to take a different stance or saying, this is why he's definitely going to win, and this is why he's a better candidate than the other likely candidate. So in this particular sense, I guess, Bolsonaro. So this is the differentiation or the burden of proof, and it's the strategic choice that you guys can make from OG, and how burdens of proof can shift in some debates from OG to CG, and how closing argument can win if they assume a bigger burden than opening, which it doesn't have to be the case that this is something which is good, right? So if your OG ran the case that running itself is good, but they made it in a bad way, you can probably win from closing by explaining why Lula running in and of itself is a benefit, right? The same thing from opposition. So if opposition was very vague and said, Lula is just going to polarize the field, this is bad. If the analysis we can do is something along the lines of Nicolas, getting more reasons why this is the case, more contextualization of how this would happen, what would be actors, you can run this extension, you can analyze the extension, right? But just as a general thought, oftentimes people take bigger burdens, which they identify that the openings have missed, if they can prove them, and this is how they win from closing. Okay, so I would close the prep time framing burdens of proof part here, and I would talk a little bit more about the engaging, weighing with some references to metadebating, if that's cool. Do you guys have any questions before we start with this? Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
okay, I have one question. If my closing half like is very good, should I aim for a major burden so I can like put them aside even before they perform, or even before they give them their speech, or should I still like stick to the low burden and like aim at a second or something like that?
Well, I think it depends on the situation and how much you can prove the bigger burden. If you can prove the bigger burden, that might be a good strategy if you have someone who is extending over you, who is important. But probably an equally good strategy in this sort of scenario is to just, do the low burden and then do the even if scenario. So, if you do the low burden, you're probably winning against, let's say, the teams which are on the opposite bench. So this is at least a second. And then with the even if scenario, you're trying to also outmaneuver your closing in that scenario. So I would first take a second, then go for first, unless it's a situation where you want to go for first, which is largely finals, where it doesn't matter if you're second or fourth. In this sort of scenario, I would take maybe the big burden and try to unease the debate in that way. So the important thing is, if you're taking the big burden from OG, make sure that everyone knows that you're taking the big burden to some extent, so that they kind of like appreciate the bravery of your case, and make sure that you explain that your closing also has to take the big burden, right? Because you don't want the opposite to happen to you. That you take the big burden, it's not that proven, and then your closing takes the small burden, and they win with this, because they say, okay, OG tried to prove this, they failed. Here's why we're going to prove that just this very fact is enough for us to win the debate. So we basically have to rhetorically and in the setup of the debate make it seem like that they are contradicting you, that they are knifing you if they take a smaller burden, even if that's not the case, right? You still need to play it in a way so that the panel and them feel that it's going to be very bad for them if they do so. So this is a start of the meta thing, I believe, already. But basically, when it comes to engagement and meta debating and rebuttal as a whole, I think there are 5 ways in which you can engage. So I think the two we have already talked about. So for example, in terms of preemptive engagement, so trying to outframe things, out-analyze, or points you anticipate will happen in debate. This is what we mostly covered through prep time and framing and how we can achieve it there. I think there is also 3 other types. One is active engagement. So this is rebuttal, mitigation, comparison, weighing. The second one is passive engagement. Oftentimes, you don't have to actively engage with everything what was said on the opposition team. This is when teams do line by line rebuttal to everything that was said, and then they spend 5 minutes rebutting a 7-minute speech. Oftentimes, there's no need to do this. Oftentimes, the strength of your material or the contribution to the debate just simply outweighs some of the things. That's one of the things that people nowadays most often, I think, do wrongly. And people back in the day, so when I started debating, maybe 2016, 17, this is when they were doing this much less, and they were really better at this, because they oftentimes would not rebut in the full sense of these things, but would leave contributions and things proven on the other side, but would spend much more time weighing it in a way which is a little bit on the borderline sarcastic or funny. And this is how they would basically be using this to outweigh their contributions. They would say, of course, this motion has a gap, of course, this motion has an op, but we are a little bit better here, right? And nowadays, people sometimes make the mistake of necessarily having to rebut everything which is said on the opposition side, or on the opposition side. No, there are different contributions. You can mitigate, you can rebut some of the parts, but in the end, you show why your contribution is better to the debate, right? Why your extension is the most important thing in debate. It doesn't matter if their extension is also really important if yours is bigger, right? So this is generally the mindset through which you should see engagement with other teams. It's not the rebuttal and the engagement with other teams, specifically coming from closing, is not an engagement per se. It's not that you can tick the box and say, okay, I did some rebuttal, that's good, I fulfilled my role. But it's basically to figure out how your contribution is the most important thing in the debate. So think of your extension as something which is, running to win the race, and basically other teams are throwing obstacles on the way. And the rebuttal, the engagement which you have, is to remove these things, right? And depending on how much you are removing these things, on how much you are just yelling to someone in the audience when you are doing the race, this is a good balance or a good way of thinking from closing positions in how much you should engage or how much you shouldn't. And there are obviously points of information which are really useful in these sort of scenarios. So they can also act as a really good engagement specifically from opening. So what is basically important for the active engagement? It's important to listen, taking in terms of notes exactly what the other team has said. Without this, you're going to strawman, and you know how it feels when you are strawman, when the other teams just do not engage with the best version of your case, but engage with something that was not said, but it was easy for them to rebut. It's not a good feeling, but it's also not a productive feeling, because oftentimes people see this and then you lose because they see that you haven't engaged. But also, you should listen to responses from your opening and figuring out if you can beat those and how. And I think that you should, in this sort of scenario, although we are mostly talking about online debating right now, but you should minimize the talking while the debate happens. You should maximize the writing. This is the way in which how you communicate with your partner. This is specifically easy now because you can just type in the chat. There are no problems with handwriting. You can see it all the time, no matter what you use. But you should write things instead of listening to things from your partner, because this maximizes the amount of time that you can hear to the debate unfolding. And if you miss some of the things here, if you miss the rebuttal which was happening in opening, you might make the mistake of basically repeating that rebuttal, and then it's not going to count as an extension. But also, I think you should take into account positional differences when engaging. So when your partner cannot listen and create his speech, etc., etc. And this is something which is very, very easy, and something which is very obvious. But for some reason, not a lot of people do this, or sometimes people do not do it in a good way. So when you are closing argument, you have only one speech to engage with closing opposition, which means that basically you, as the whip, need to be 100% listening to the member of opposition. And it also means that your member needs to be figuring out and writing you you should divide the work. You should say, okay, I've listened to the first 2 minutes of his extension. He said 2 basic things. I can rebut the second one. Can you please make me rebuttal for the first one? And then your partner says, okay, rebuttal, and then this is the engagement that we have. Or your partner says, this is what I said in the extension. This actually tackles this part of the case in this and this way, right? So you can integrate this in whipping the extension as well. On the other hand, what this also means is that you comparatively have little time to engage with your opening. And that in this sort of scenario, specifically when we're talking about the deputy prime minister, because, the deputy leader of the opposition, because when deputy leader of the opposition is speaking, your partner, who is member of government, has to either pay very close attention to the deputy leader of the opposition or work on their extension. And this is oftentimes very difficult, because on one hand, you have to figure out how to develop the extension, how to bring the material into the debate. On the other hand, you should also think about how to respond to the deputy leader of the opposition. So obviously, in these cases, you as the whip, you are on POI duty, you are asking POIs, and you are filling in your partner on what is good rebuttal to the deputy leader of the opposition, so that they can focus themselves, with one ear they listen to the deputy leader of the opposition, and with one ear, with the other ear or hand or whatever, they're writing their case, their extension. So this is the type of synergy which needs to happen specifically when you are closing. When you're, for example, on the other hand, when you are closing opposition, things are a little bit different here. You can take a bunch more engagement with opening argument here. So, because it's probably comparatively harder to extend on opening opposition than on opening argument, because there is a 7-minute difference. right? So, you have more, when you are member of government, there has been, what, 28 minutes of the debate. When you are a member of opposition, there has been 35 minutes of debate. So, it might be harder in this sort of scenario to extend on opening opposition, just for the reason that opening opposition had more time, basically, to develop their case. And they could engage with a whole team on government, versus the DPM can only engage with leader of the opposition. So in that sort of scenario, you as member of the opposition can and should spend some of the time engaging with opening government and with closing government, but you should spend more time figuring out why your case is something which is extending opening opposition in that sort of scenario, because you can rely on your whip to basically engage really hard with closing government. So these are just like some strategic things. Obviously, this is not a rule which happens in every debate. In some debate, you're going to be CG, and then your opening opposition is going to be really strong, and your closing opposition is not going to be really strong. And then you're going to be, okay, we need to focus more on opening opposition. But in general, you'll see that there is a pattern on how people engage in these things. So obviously, you should write down stuff. That this is something which is important. I think that make sure that your partner can read this, that they also have thoughts here. Probably you should not be reliant on notes as well. So you can do practices where you debate without notes. At the beginning, it's very scary. Once you do it a couple of times, it's very cool. So just normal round, there's a motion, and you debate without notes. It's very cool. After you've done it a couple of times, you realize how more efficient you could be with your notes. And at that point, you have more time, to think about things where you don't have to write everything down, specifically with rebuttal, etc. But when it comes to actual rebuttal, and this is probably the most important thing in terms of engagements, and it revolves also a lot of meta debating and specifically some of the ESL stuff that I want to talk about. Be specific in your expression. So steal phrases from EPL people, from experienced debaters, such as, and you practice until you add them to your debate dictionary. That's how all of us are learning words in the beginning. When you are 1 or 2 years old, that's how you learn words. That's how you learn words in debating. It doesn't matter if it's your own language. Probably when a lot of you obviously debate in Portuguese as well. So when you started debating, you talked like normal people. Now a lot of you talk like debaters when you debate, which is a good and a terrifying thing at the same time. But here we are. But basically, at that point, take some of the lingo, because what makes lingo important is that it allows people to focus on your speech a little bit more and to follow the speech. And I'm not saying you should try to mimic the accent, or you should try to talk like people use these high words like EPL. No. Accent, if you can be understood, accent is not important that much. What is important is flow, so how you are speaking, basically, and is it easy to follow you? And the second thing is that these little things where no one listens to a 7-minute speech with 100% confidence, not confidence, but like what's the word? Attention, let's say. Specifically, when there are 8 of these speeches, which means that you are fighting constantly for the attention of the panel and of the people who supposed to listen to you. A lot of you here have judged, and when the whip speeches are speaking, that you oftentimes want to figure out what happened in the debate, right? This is normal when you're a judge. You already know there are 6 or 7 speeches, and then you're trying to, okay, the whip is speaking, but I'm also going to take a look at what happened in OG to maybe, write some things, especially if you're a chair and you need to give OA, blah, 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 blah. So this is the time where you're fighting with people, and how you're going to express yourself in rebuttal makes a difference to how much people are going to listen and how much this is going to be credited. As with everything in debating, it just makes you more persuasive. So things like, here is why this is symmetric. Here is why this is not comparative. They say, their claim, on this X point, or proposition government wants you to believe this, or the prime minister, deputy prime minister asserts this, or engaging with this point on the point of. These are all things which basically waste you 1 or 2 seconds. and are good intro to what you're going to say next. On the other hand, once you do the meat of the rebuttal, so you have this intro, and then you have the meat, then you say why they are wrong. You should, on the end of this claim, you should say why this is important. So, for example, thus their framing does not stand in this debate, or the opposite of their framing is true, or their argument is not correct, or this means that their point is mitigated, right? So this is a free part. So the intro, the meat of the rebuttal, and then at the end, the quantifier, what you did with this rebuttal. Because in the end, it's about how people perceive your rebuttal. It's not what is in your head. In your head, you can know that their case is bullshit, but it's how people perceive what's in your head, how you do this with your speech, which counts in the end. And this is the important thing, how you can do this. So a couple of maybe ways in how you can do this more concretely. So for example, analysis, not examples, definitely. So in IR debates, like do not do tennis. They are just like examples. So you can say sanctions were wrong there, or sanctions did not work there, and sanctions did work here, obviously. So this is the extent of the examples and how they work in IR. So have some sort of analysis or rebuttal which basically tackles the underlying issue of the case or the underlying premises. And I think when we're talking about when we are talking about being comparative, so a couple of ways in which how you can continue your rebuttal. So I want to be clear here, because I have a feeling that I've been a little bit confusing. So basically, rebuttal can decrease the amount of impact or mechanisms or how much people believe they're framing. The continuation of rebuttal then, and this is where we're getting into weighing, is to use this rebuttal and to compare it to your case. The most concrete example is to use this rebuttal and compare it to your extension. And ways in which you can do this, or a couple of metrics, is, for example, the number of people that this affects, right? So whether your arguments or their arguments or framing or contributions in the debate affect more or less people. What is the intensity of impact? If this is going to hurt, I don't know, thousands of people, it's going to decrease their, wages by $1. But maybe you will have an argument which says that 10 people are going to get really better off, who are maybe, I don't know, homeless, and now you are providing them shelters. Then it's not clear that just because an impact affects more people, it is more important. The impact of the argument is also which is important. But also whether this can be reversed in terms of whether if the policy is bad, whether we can go back as normal or not. But also, what are the long-term versus the short-term consequences? So sometimes the debate can be won on maybe in the short term this is not ideal, but in the long term we actually propose why this is going to lead to a better outcome. Maybe the example can be oftentimes not used, but can be used in this way. Why basically having a balanced budget in the short term is probably bad for people, but in the long term might lead to your interest rates decreasing, meaning that in the long term you're actually going to have more money to spend on social welfare or basically on the state help to the economy. And then I think lastly, probability. What is the probability of the outcome happening? Things can have very little probability, but can be very impactful. So, the probability that you are getting caught with something illegal, let's say, somewhere, is probably very low to some extent. Let's say that you are flying. You go to Amsterdam, it's very chill, Worlds is there, and you decide to go back. You bring a little fun with you. Probability is very low. But if it happens, it's a big problem for you, obviously, right? It's not great for your employment. If you're a student, you have to tell your parents, and they're not going to be pleased that you're a little international drug trafficker right now. So obviously, sometimes arguments can be of very low probability, but the impact of them happening can be very great. And you can say this, and you can, contribute this in the debate. And these arguments can defeat arguments which are more probable in happening, but they don't have that much big of an impact. And lastly, I say lessly, but this is oftentimes used, oftentimes overused, is the idea of how vulnerable people are. So the common how they say, the common thing which debaters do is they say that, you know, minorities are more vulnerable than people who are not minorities, so the impacts which affect them should be prioritized. This is sometimes overused, right? And it is not clear to what extent this should be the case, because recognize that we as society, for example, prioritize kids, right? In terms of, you know, how much funding you get to kids and how much you as society, basically, you know, you're always going to say, okay, let the kid eat first, or let the kid not queue, or let the kid take a seat here, or, you know, you're going to protect the kid, cover the kid if there's rain or whatever. But this is not absolute. So be mindful here that you cannot win debates if you're just going to claim, okay, this is going to benefit kids. So I don't know, we should just ban all adults from driving their cars because kids are going to be safer when they go to school, right? So obviously this is an exaggeration, but this oftentimes happens with the vulnerability argument. And then the last thing which I want to say to you, I think it's important that you call out people when you're doing rebuttal. So basically, if they're strawmanning you, say that they're strawmanning you. If they are not realistic in their framing, say that they are not realistic in their framing. And I think this attitude, so how you know, I shall say, you shouldn't be arrogant. You shouldn't be, you know, the team that no one likes. But when something is happening to you, particularly on the metrics of strawmanning or lack of engagement, and you know you have a good case, and it's just that the team doesn't believe that you are good because you are maybe underdogs in this room or whatever, you should call them out on this. And you should increase a little bit of like the public choice theory, economics, what maybe some of you are studying. For a panelist, or for chairs, or for people who are judging, there is a certain risk that they are taking if they are giving it to the more rapid team, to the more EPL team, to the team who they think that that is going to win the round. You are increasing this risk if you are pointing out exact ways where they did not engage, where they strawmanned your case, where they did not listen, or just providing that you are confident that you're going to win the round. Because then they have to think twice, and probably maybe they're going to have someone on the panel who is also going to catch this. So it's very important that when you are doing rebuttal, when you are doing engagement, that you do it from a position of someone who, you know, wants to win the debate, someone who presents themselves in that way. Specifically, in the case which is going to happen a lot in world and internationals, where there might be a language difference, or where there might be a rep difference, or whatever, right? So these are important things, how you equalize these things, how you make it harder for someone to win on the basis of not being better than you, but on the basis of, you know, being someone being in a better position or more experienced in the circuit. So I don't want to make a how do you say, like a bad case here and like scare you that like this is what international debating looks like. We just give, you know, the first to my friend who I drank beer yesterday. It's not like that. But obviously you all have debated, you know, this sometimes happens, right? So if someone wins the Brazilian nationals or the Portuguese worlds, and if you are in the same room as them, you know, they can underanalyze stuff, but people are still going to believe that it's true, right? So this is how we are as a community. Obviously, it's good that you don't judge like that, but you know, as they say in good term, star power check. I like this. I'm going to use this in the future. So it's better to be sure. You know how they say in that TV show Chernobyl, trust but verify. So this is what you're doing here. Okay. So also one last thing when it comes to these like ESL things or things of necessarily how you can throw this into your advantage, or basically, and like obviously I'm talking this to you from my own experience, right? So this is when we were starting, this was the same things happening to us. So we figured out some ways how to flip these things. Oftentimes you're going to have an equalizer in knowledge or your perspective, or on conflict or religion, or just in terms of the things which are prevalent and prominent in your circuit or in your societies, and you can oftentimes overframe or engage a debate in that way. So I don't know. One time I remember this very vividly because it was a motion about universities doing X or Y. Doesn't matter what the motion was about, but basically one team, I think they were from UK, had this whole contextualization about how their universities, when they are on exam periods in the library, they bring puppies to them. So they bring puppies, and then if you're really stressed, you can pet the puppies, and then this decreases the amount of stress. Now, at that time, we had exams in Zagreb, and basically there were, I don't know, 100 places in our library, and there were 1,000 people who wanted to study. So people were basically, you know, going into fights for the place. You know, someone would just leave the notebook there and go to the toilet, and then another person would just like remove the notebook and sit there. And I was thinking, oh my God, like what type of how should I engage with puppies? Like there's no space for my notebook. So usually the opposite is also the case. When someone is going to run a very, I don't know, usually how we manage to oftentimes win this case was, for example, on feminism. So basically in let's say West or more woke parts of the world, there are different issues which women are facing or which are prominent in media, which, you know, are required a lot of attention than in, for example, Croatia. I'm not sure where Brazil is on that spectrum between, I don't know, Croatia and the United States, or Croatia or Sweden, where probably things are very like woke and liberal. But oftentimes you can just, you know, overturn the debate or reframe the debate just on the basis of explaining that, you know, okay, this might be the most prominent issue in these sort of settings, but in a lot of other settings, you know, there are more basic issues, or, you know, issues which might have been like tackled in some of the countries, which are still the most relevant issues, right? So do not be afraid of asserting your perspective on the debate. So specifically, I think, I mean, you know this best, but coming from Brazil, you have a lot of different perspectives on a lot of different issues, from development to, I think, like multiculturality in your country, to different politics, very interesting politics lately. So these are things, obviously, you're not going to say, you know, use only Brazilian examples in international debates and be like, no, this is the only thing which matters. But think of your examples and make them into narratives which are applicable into analysis, which is structural, which is also applicable to half of the world as well, right? So this is an important way of how you can use something which you probably have more knowledge than other people who do not have these circumstances. Then try to frame the debate in that way, and be assertive about it, and use this to kind of like equalize maybe the difference between if someone is a native speaker. Okay, sure they are, but at some point you're going to come at the position where you can battle with them, and it's not going to be a problem, and you have some advantages which they might find harder to mimic. Okay, guys, so this is what I have basically in terms of talking, or in terms of doing this. So I want to open the floor now to some of the questions which you guys might have.
I have a question. It's actually about a scenario that I see pretty commonly happening, and I find it quite hard to get out of. So like, imagine you are closing a position, and your opening opposition was really good, but the government bench was just like lacked in skills, or did it poorly at the debate, and also failed to give proper rebuttal to your opening. How in that scenario you managed to win as closing opposition for your opening?
So usually what you can almost always do in this scenario is you can overplay the arguments coming from governments. So meaning that opening opposition probably responded to arguments coming from opening government, which were bad, right? Closing government then was also kind of bad. What you can do is you can recreate the case for closing government and make it sound like it's better than it actually is. Therefore, then asserting different level of responses from opening opposition. So in this particular, what we talked about today, let's connect it, you can assert a higher burden of proof to what you're going to respond. So you can say, you know, largely the case from opening government in this case was asserting on if Lula is going to win and how this is beneficial. We from closing opposition are going to engage with a scenario where just running is a benefit, and we're going to win on this. And this is more important than what our opening brings in this debate. I want to say also that sometimes this is not possible. Sometimes if it's a maybe shallowish motion, or if opening is really good, you are going to lose from them. In these sort of scenarios, it's important to be smart and to take a second while not trying that hard to take a first, as opposed to trying very hard to take a first and take a fourth, right? So sometimes you have to strategize and basically, lose to your opening at the cost. That's the cost, and the benefit is that you're going to win on the gov bench in these sort of scenarios. But obviously, everything we talked about here also applies in terms of weighing. You as whip should probably focus and spend most time on explaining why, if your extension is an analysis extension, why specifically list things which were said in opening opposition, list their mechanisms, list your mechanisms, and compare why your mechanisms are better. List or say what their framing was, say what their rebuttal was to the government bench, then list your framing, say why it was better. I think most judges know if you're being honest to some extent, or if you're not being honest when you're whipping the case. So obviously, you're never going to be completely honest. You're not going to say, "Oh no, opening opposition was very good. They can win over us." But you should be, when you are identifying what they said, this is the part where you should be honest and really truly say what was brought in opening opposition, and then try to figure out how your extension is better than this, engages with this content, overpasses it in terms of contribution to the debate. So yeah, this is generally how I would approach that. Other questions?
I kind
So
of have
let's-
another, if no one will. When you were talking about like how you can somehow take arguments that have a low probability of happening but have a high impact and win the debate with them, I kind of didn't understand properly how you can like weigh that against an argument that is well proven. Because what I see most of the times happening is, even if you like spend some time saying, "Oh, just the risk of this happening is something that should be relevant in this debate," judges will just say, "Okay, but there's a really low probability of it happening. You didn't prove enough that it will happen." So how can you weight that efficiently?
So you first have to create a scenario where probabilities matter in a way that it's not a 0 or 1, but you have to say to the judge, okay, out of the 100 plausible scenarios, in 20 cases this is going to happen, and then it's problematic. And then you say, we have no way, we have no use the epistemic access to see which one of these is going to happen, so you shouldn't take the risk that in 20% of cases this is how it happens. So I'm gonna give you one example of one final that I lost. So it was basically Greece, and you heard probably like how they were in debt in the 2010s, and this was very problematic because they almost went bankrupt. And in this whole process, they had a lot of negotiation with the European Union, and the motion was basically that they, to some extent, should have not accepted the deal, but basically asked for a lot more of their, for better conditions, so that they forgive them a lot more of their debt, that they don't have to follow certain rules which they have to follow now, blah blah blah. So an opening was really, really good. So opening opposition. So they basically listed, why they wouldn't get better conditions, why this would be problematic for them, blah blah blah. What we tried to extend on from closing, I mean, we failed obviously here. We didn't weigh it good enough. So it was your first question which happened. But basically, in this sort of case, what we try to explain is, in some scenarios, it's not that they would get a worse deal, as our opposition or opening opposition is saying, in terms of if they didn't make the deal at, I don't know, in September, but waited till November, the deal in November would be worse for them. This is what opening opposition said, and why they should have accepted the first deal. But what we were trying to claim is, by November or by December, it doesn't matter, there might be cases where they're not going to make a deal. right? Because expectations from their side are going to be like, now we're going to win against these like big problematic bankers from Europe. And then from Europe, it would be like, why are they not accepting? We are already doing some good things to them. So there is a small possibility that they wouldn't make a deal in the end. And this is then a high impact scenario where if there's no deal, the government defaults, they have no money for wages, for paychecks, people are going to panic, the whole economy is going to crumble, right? So this is probably not the realistic scenario in terms of that it's not the highest probability scenario. But in this debate, if you are successful, you can actively argue that, you know, because not taking the deal means that there are a couple of scenarios where the deal is not made in the end. This is more important than the rest of the scenarios where the deal happens in the end, but it is worse than the initial deal, right? If that makes sense as a concrete example, I would say. But first you have to establish this sort of framing, this sort of metric where you explain to the panel the deals. This is how the negotiation process is done. Oftentimes people just do not make deals. Oftentimes deals fall apart. Egos have a lot to do with this here. There are other ways of doing this. There are other influences on this, political pressures, blah, blah, blah. Okay, let's check.
I have one question. Like, if my extension, like you said, like that as a whip, we should like try to get rid of the obstacles that are put in front of our extension. But like, if our extension is already dealing really well with the debate, how do I as a whip speaker, like, how can I add content to it? And besides that, like I guess I read in debating series posting like a comment from Harish, and he said that like his whip was some kind of like an extension of his extension. And like I was trying to think like if this like how do I extend my extension without bringing new arguments, and like how do I get to do like the best whip possible, either like in a high room or in a bin room, like the first round room or something like that.
So yeah, I think these are two questions. I think your first question is you should just be happy. I mean, if your extension has won the debate, and you as whip are like, okay, we've won after my extension speaker, then congratulations. Obviously, there are things which you can still do as whip for you guys to get good speaks as a team, or you know, just like to be better. But this is a very good situation. Usually, this is not the case. Usually, your extension can win the debate, but you need to do the work as the whip. And what I haven't read the Harish's comment, but I'm sure it was good because it's Harish to some extent, one of the best debaters ever, won against a robot. That really is something in that debate. So basically, how you can do this from a whip perspective is that oftentimes extensions bring out arguments which are not contextualized, which are not weighted against other teams, and which are not clear in what is their impact on the debate. So the argument is there, the argument is true, but because extension speakers usually prioritize method dumping, mechanization dumping, analysis dumping, the weighing of that case and why it beats, you know, also the other contributions from opening or from closing is what you do in whip. The impacting is also what you do in the whip. So if this is true, this is how this changes the world. This is how people are going to be impacted in this or that way. But also the mitigation of other cases is an inherent part of the whip in the case that you have a good extension which brings a lot of material and doesn't have necessarily time to do that. So, you know, again, a little bit of mathematics. It can be the case that this is the case, so OG, O, CG, CO. Like this is what someone would give in terms of what the quality of the contributions are. And then you are the opposition whip. So, and then, you know, it's enough that you do this, basically, that you give some reasons. You know, obviously to opening opposition, you're going to say, oh, this is why they are wrong. But you're going to say, okay, listen, in the first clash, they are both kind of falling on the same place, but here is why, you know, a part of content from opening argument is not standing. Here's why opening opposition does not beat that. you directly engage with closing argument, and you haven't really done a lot to your extension, but you have mitigated, you have decreased the contributions of other teams. Now, I think in most whip speeches, you are going to do all of the above. So you're going to take your extension while your extension is happening, and this is something which you should also be paying attention to. You should already be figuring out what parts were well done, what parts were not well done. And you know this, right? Specifically, if you were the one who presented the content to your whip speaker, to your extension speaker, sorry. Because, I don't know, if one of you likes religion, and the person who is doing this, who's doing the extension, is not very good at religious debates, you're going to know which parts of the case you need to re-explain, rebuild, recontextualize, maybe, you know, make the mechanisms better. So this is the first, I think, approach in concretely what you can do. You follow the extension, you see where are the gaps that you need to fill, and that's a part of your speech. Secondly, you see how the reactions of the panel are, reactions of other teams, where they are asking POIs to you, etc., etc. So you see what the important part of the extension is to compare with other teams. And then thirdly, you see which are the important parts of the other cases to defeat, in terms of to mitigate, to show rebuttal to, and in the end to weigh this. So the structure of the whip depends. I think it's best if it depends based on what you need to do in this debate. Sometimes you need to rebut more, sometimes you need to explain your extension a little bit more, be careful that it's not whip extension, so that you kind of like pack it a little bit, so that you say a couple of times that this was already said in the extension speech, even if it wasn't, or you find a way how to, you know, like sneak in a little bit of constructive through the rebuttal. I mean, obviously, I'm not like saying to you guys, oh, you should break the rules, but these things are gray. So if you make them more white, you know, they are going to slip. If you are like, oh no, then I'm making a thing which I shouldn't be doing, then obviously people are going to penalize you for it. So this is my response to what you can do as whip in these sort of scenarios, right?
Thanks.
And let's check if there's no more questions here. Let's check if I have answered the ones that you sent to me, Nicholas. So there was one, how to preempt. I think we've covered this mostly. How to compare, we basically just talked about. How to sell to judge. Yeah, matter load or setup from PM, both. But oftentimes people just matter dump, and it's more important, I think, to set up in that, from that perspective. So which analysis to choose from opening, how to frame the debate. I think we also talked about this in terms of proof loading, burden of proof, and basically framing, how to figure out the prep. And then the two questions which relied on whip speeches is how to prove if extension won the debate, and how to choose clashes. Well, I mean, a large part of this was what I was talking about before. It is to some extent a function of your experience and the hunch. So, but it is also, I think, a part of how you make yourself a listener who is going to take down, internalize, and think about the most important parts of the debate. Obviously, if you're going to write down everything which was said by previous speakers, you're in problem. So I think the more you self-discipline yourself, and you see through, you know, try and fail. This is what we humans are really good at. This is how we basically achieve most of our progress. You try and decrease the amount of things you're writing, and then you see if you have missed an important thing. Then next time, that important thing is you write it down, but other things you basically do not write down. And the more you do this, in the end, the more you're going to be able to crystallize your speech and to engage with the most important material, to leave the least important material standing, and it's going to be fine, because you're going to win either way, right? Or you're going to perform well, or you're going to have fun. I don't know. There are various metrics of what you're expecting. and it's good, or it's cool if you have any of them. But this is obviously from a little bit more competitive perspective. Someone who is a whip asked, or maybe someone who is extension wants to like give their whip advices. They're not satisfied. But let's be optimistic. Let's say that it's the whip asking for themselves. Okay, guys. So I'm gonna ask if anyone has a last question that we can take. Okay. Then, from my perspective, we can start wrapping it up. I want to say that I am available if you guys want to do a follow-up or something. Just send me a message on Facebook. I think this is preferable for me. Yeah, Jessica. I don't, but that's glad. Hopefully, I can visit sometimes. And do you know, like, do you know how good of a caipirinha I make? Like, it's a fake one because I don't have all of the ingredients. But last summer I did a lot of it, and I think I can compete with you guys. You can show me how it's done locally. So this is what we're gonna do. Hopefully, when it gets back to life. And for all the people referencing football, we're definitely gonna play football in the competitions. So this is a tradition. So we will see.
Really?
Yeah, like we played a couple of times before. So this is something which we are looking for. Everyone played, by the way. So we just made teams, and it was cool. But anyhow, so we're looking to making this more institutionalized at some point, so that you know, we're going to have more trainers, and it's going to be a part of our training program. For now, we are doing this when we can, when we find time. Obviously, all of us have jobs, unis, blah blah blah. So at this point, it is more sporadic. But hopefully this helps, and the goal is, as I said, to integrate you folks more, and to like it's not a problem, but it's just status quo that you have a big domestic circle and you have your own worlds, and this is like where things are very known for you guys. You have established your own norms, and you know friends, and this is what your tournaments. Obviously, if I had a big Croatian Worlds, I wouldn't be that keen in speaking in English, because I hang out mostly with Croats and Serbs in that extent, and this is something which is normal because no language barrier. But also, I think that it is cool if you guys try and do the English participation in Worlds specifically. So I think this is something which we can all do, and that's something which is the goal. Obviously, a lot of you already went and are going to go, but there is a big pool. There is a big pool of people who are not going and who maybe would want to go. Especially now, I know that, of course, for a lot of us, costs are a problem. But now that it is online, you know, the cost is smaller, right? Yeah, sorry, my dad was doing something here. I'm doing good.
So thank you so much, Lovro. It was really amazing, really helpful.
Thank you. I'm glad. So if you guys have any questions, just PM me. I'm going to respond. So thank you to Nicholas, who invited me as well, and to everyone who participated in the organization. And that's it. You guys have a good, cool afternoon, and see you all sometime later.
Good afternoon. Bye-bye.
See you.